Who are we? Well, I'm Bernie. I'm a retired senior executive from the trucking transportation industry, former classmate of my partner in crime, Dick. And we hope to provide a senior perspective to people of all ages on the current events of the day, and also some anecdotal stuff and some humor, I hope.
Okay, I'm Dick. I'm 74. I'm a retired military officer. After leaving the military, I taught high school for 15 years, basically psychology, and I'm not happy the way the world is going. Oh, hey Burns, how's it?
I'm doing okay, Dick. How about you?
Well, I want to do a new series, and I want to call it Tips and Tricks. You know, have you ever gone to customer service at somebody and you punch one for English, then you have to punch, what do you want? What do you want? It goes on and on and on, and finally you get disconnected.
I sure have. I think 13 is for Polish, right?
Probably. A trick I learned a long time ago, and I didn't use until I was trying to get through to PayPal. And I kept on getting sent to areas that asked me questions that had nothing whatsoever to do with what was being discussed. And I remembered what you can do when they ask for a response is go representative, representative, representative. And if you do that about 10 times, you'll bypass all that stuff and you'll get to a real human. Now, sometimes representative doesn't work. You got to go human, 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 human. I was on a waiting list for an hour and a half, and when I tried this trick yesterday, I got through in about 5 seconds, and they solved my problem.
And so what you're telling me is that much like the people that show up at movie theaters and try to cut in a long line, you leapfrogged ahead of people waiting, might have been already waiting an hour.
Of course. Okay, next thing I want
to you want to move on, right?
No, I just wanted to pass that tip on because, I don't like to see people wait on the phone for 2 hours for a response when you can short circuit the whole phone free thing. It works well.
The key to your tips and tricks, or singular tip and trick that you just gave us, is whether that'll work with Medicare. Because I don't think a howitzer will get you through any faster to Medicare.
Well, I don't know. I've never tried that. But
well, that's because you're independently wealthy, and I'm kind of a peon and a victim of the state.
Well, it's better to be peed on than peed off. Okay, next thing I wanted to discuss. There's been a lot of talk. Now they're accusing the military, specifically General Milne, of having the military teach Marxism, Leninism, and my favorite topic, critical race theory.
Critical race theory?
Yeah, which I still haven't figured out. I've read a lot on it. I can't figure it out. But, I wanted to say that going back to Claremont, I have no problem with somebody teaching Marxism, Leninism, or anything else, as long as they're also taught how to do a critical analysis of it. In other words, instead of this is what you need to learn and this is how it applies, you teach the basic theory, you teach the pros and cons, and then the individual makes up their own opinion, on how the thing goes. And yet now we're in this thing like, well, you can't teach it. That's the Republicans, I guess. And then you got the Democrats saying you have to teach it because it's God's law. And it's baloney. First of all, the military teaching Marxism and everything else is baloney. I've been to I don't know how many different, infantry basic, infantry advanced, command and general staff college, and you studied all this just to find out the alternative and how we got to where we went and how we want to go to where we're going. Somehow that got lost. And I think it goes back to the unwillingness of the educational system to teach critical thinking.
I totally agree with your point. And what I would add to it is that your statement ought to apply to the teaching of the fundamental principles of the American founding, our democratic republic. In other words, there ought to be a balance. I don't have an issue with studying the original text to have a better understanding of the political philosophy of communism. And hopefully people will think critically and find it absolutely repugnant, and that it's not an efficacious philosophy by which a nation should govern itself. But I'm good with what you're saying. Any more than I don't want to be myself or any conservative branded and we shouldn't be listened to or analyzed, or in the case of greater minds than my own, studied, so that people understand the conservative approach. That, as an example, the founding and what our founding fathers were thinking, and the strong connection, linkage between the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. So I'm good with what you just said.
Well, I was going to say something else, but the thought escaped me, but now it's back. If you look at these things as a political philosophy and don't focus on the fact that there are people who tried it, like Stalin, like Hitler and God knows who. If you go back to the pure philosophy, there's nothing wrong with it. The people that screw it up are the leaders. Take a look at Mein Kampf, for example, and I've got an autographed copy, as probably do a lot of people. But if you go to the basic theory that's in there, not a problem. The problem is the humans tried to implement it and they screwed it all up. And then the assumption is on one side, well, they screwed it up and hence it doesn't work. And on the other side, you got what's being pushed along now is, it's the Holy Grail. Everything's going to be really great. Neither answer is correct.
Well, in terms of communism and its teachings, are you saying that isn't a half bad philosophy, but people screw it up?
Yeah, I think so. After reading.
Well, I disagree with you then on that.
Well,
I liked your earlier point. I don't much like this one.
Well, no, what I'm saying, as a political conjunct, I have no heartburn with it. However, I don't want to live under it because I don't agree with the precepts. But just because I don't agree with the precepts doesn't mean it's invalid. It's invalid because those that tried to implement it, Stalin, Hitler, wherever else they've done it, they screwed it up.
Well, I'm going to oversimplify, and I'm admitting openly to this, but isn't the essential difference between capitalism and socialism / communism, because socialism evolves into communism in its purest form, is that in capitalism, there is no guaranteed equality of outcomes. In an ideal capitalistic society, and we're not there, you kind of are all at a starting line and get a fair shot at succeeding and having a good life. Whereas in communism, which I think is the antithesis, everyone is supposed to be assured, and that's how it's peddled, to have equality of outcomes. you all live in a commune and everybody gets an equal portion of food, and assets are allocated equally, et cetera, et cetera. I know that's very simplified, rudimentary, but I don't like the notion, and it's insinuated itself into our American colleges, universities, and certainly the politics. I would guess, going back at least to Woodrow Wilson, that people should have equal outcomes. And I don't buy that. I don't think that's possible in the world.
I would agree, but I also think if you go back to the founding precepts of capitalism and communism, the same screw-ups have occurred. You put the politicians in charge, and no matter what system you're under, they manage to screw it up.
That I agree with. I mean, I'm more interested maybe in Milton Friedman's approach than John Keynes, as an example. So
I would agree.
You have different flavors of capitalism, and as people like those two individuals, preeminent economists who influence different politicians ultimately in different ways than the purest form of capitalism, as it might be understood, gets distorted. And the same is true to your earlier point of socialism, communism.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say, and you put it succinctly. In other words, the same complaints one would have against communism and socialism, you can level against how capitalism has developed. And it's interesting, and again, I love the Smithsonian Channel. They have the Titans who built America.
Yeah.
And you get an analysis of Henry Ford, the anti-Semite, who worked his thing, J. Pierpont Morgan, Andrew Carnegie. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on, and the same issues come up. And if you watch it from that standpoint, as opposed to the fact they became the richest people in the world, and you did applied critical thought to it, you actually learn something. If you don't, wait until they have their next series on the food that made America. And that's another fantastic series on the rise of McDonald's, Reese's Pieces. It's incredible.
This is a thought that's coming off the top of my head, so it's not well thought. But you mentioned Henry Ford, and I've read biographies of Ford, and you're correct. He was definitely an anti-Semite. And, that's hateful. But what would we have done in World War II without Henry Ford and the application of his assembly line and mechanization to building aircraft? I mean, and he's just one example of an industrialist that was a key in transitioning and quickly the might of our industrial machine in the United States to the war effort. And I've read a book on Ford just on what he did in turning out aircraft, because think about what happened to us near where you lived, Dick, Pearl Harbor, and how decimated we were at the onset, and how quickly we bounced back in the war effort in the Pacific, as an example.
Well, it's interesting because I'd always known about the famous Ford Trimotor, but I didn't realize that Ford actually had an aircraft company. And he kept on, debating with his son Edsel whether or not you keep it going or don't keep it going.
Yeah.
And So he basically said, shut it down. And then, as you said, it turned around in World War II and everything was there and ready to go because he didn't think he could fight against Boeing.
God,
And
we're smart.
the article had a long, for the same series, had a long thing on Boeing.
Well,
I had
well,
no knowledge.
a name much less known than Henry Ford, of course, was a fellow that converted his business to building landing craft in preparation not only for D-Day, the landing in Europe, but also the island hopping war in the Pacific, and that was Higgins out of Louisiana. That's where the Higgins boat came from. And there are countless examples of industrialists, big and small, who came to the fore and did this country a great service. And as with any men, they have flaws. And in our cancel culture today, they throw Henry Ford under the bus, even if we were at war. I mean, I'm talking about the left would. And this may be a bit of a stretch in terms of the analogy, but I'm really upset about something. Here in Texas this week, what has now become this is hard for me to even imagine, a liberal city council in Dallas, Texas, voted and had removed a tall bronze statue of a Texas Ranger that was at Love Field. And that's the other airport in the Dallas area. Oldsters like you and I remember it because that's where Kennedy flew in the day he was assassinated, and Lyndon Johnson took his oath of office following that assassination. But they took down a statue of a Texas Ranger. Meanwhile, back at the ranch in New Jersey comes to mind, but I believe it's also happened in New York and a couple other East Coast cities. This past month, they're putting up statues of Floyd, the gentleman who died presumably of asphyxiation. The cop put his knee on the guy's neck, and that was a sad occurrence. And I don't pretend to know all the facts, but what I do know that's factual is that Floyd had a rap sheet as long as Governor Cuomo's arms, and now we're deifying him. I mean, if you want to lament the death, probably accidental, and remember you talking about it in an early podcast that you thought at worst it might be manslaughter too. But if we want to lament that, fine, that's well and good. But do we make this guy an American hero? I hope not, but that's what's happening. And lastly, and I'm trying to remember where it just happened. Forgive me, folks, but they just removed the statue of Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, that's preposterous. And earlier this year, we know statues of Lincoln and statues of George Washington, and all kinds of heroes. Robert E. Lee. I mean, they really have a bone to pick with Robert E. Lee. Have come down. They want the Ten Commandments to come down.
Yeah.
The next thing you know, we'll have in lieu of the Ten Commandments, we'll have Floyd's rap sheet in bronze.
Well, the sad thing is that basically what they're doing is rewriting history, and they're rewriting history to assuage the quote disenfranchised. And if that happens, people will pay attention to history less than they have now, and we'll make the same mistakes. You know, Robert E. Lee was not only a brilliant officer, but you know, he was offered the position to command the federal troops.
Right.
And instead, he wanted to support his home state of Virginia, and he felt he just couldn't do it. Well, if you don't look at Robert Lee in the whole context, you don't learn anything about what happened.
Right.
You know, you just kind of blunder along and you think you know what happened. And the chances are it'll probably repeat itself in some situation in the future. You know, I listened to the president today, and I'm a lot more charitable, but he's talking about spending trillions to fix our infrastructure. And, you know, how's it going to be paid for? We've been down this road.
What they do, and Republicans do it too. I voted for Trump and he did this, but not to the degree Biden is proposing. Unlike private business, where if you have a major expenditure and you need to take some, you know, you need to find some cost-cutting ways to support the expenditure, and particularly when it's unexpected. And with the federal government, it's just raise taxes and print money. I mean, even states are obligated to keep a balanced budget. They're supposed to. Of course, I don't see that being applicable to unfunded pension liabilities. But you know, private business, you learn a discipline in that regard. And you know, I'm being very fundamental here, but on major capital projects, you know, if you go to your bank or group of banks to finance a major capital project, they're going to analyze your P&Ls and particularly your balance sheet and determine whether they want to loan you the money. They don't just say, fine, whatever you need, just, you know, pass it on to the consumer. I mean, the bankers know better, but our government, need I name names, particularly on the particularly on the Democratic side of damn fools? I mean, do you want AOC in charge of your money? Do you want Joe Biden in charge of your money? And God forbid Kamala Harris. And the whole group up there. We have a $30 trillion national debt, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. And Biden is spending like there's no tomorrow. And I understand the Republicans have just reached a deal on the infrastructure bill. And I know for a fact that even if they developed a compromise of sorts between the two parties, there's still going to be a ton of pork in that infrastructure bill, and nobody's waded through all of it. I mean, if people let me just say, if people think that legislators, excuse me, understand the legislation they're drafting and passing, they don't. Remember Pelosi's famous statement, we need to pass the bill to understand what's in it?
Oh, yeah. Of course, you know, what's sad, having grown up during the Eisenhower highway system and other things, the problem is things have gotten so bad in terms of maintenance and what should be done. You know, if proper maintenance had been done and everything else, we wouldn't be here. But it didn't happen. And so everything fell into disrepair. But I think we're to the point now where A couple of $1 trillion ain't gonna fix it, number one. And number two, as you said, the pork barrel issue, there's gonna be so much money squandered and wasted that the effect of what you expect, particularly when he's talking about rapid transit, it ain't gonna happen. We've got rail here in Hawaii, and it started out being budgeted, I guess, around 3 billion. Well, it's up to 11 billion and it still hasn't run. That's the way government operates.
Is that the train to nowhere?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll be able to catch it down the hill, but I can't park because they didn't put in a parking lot. And I'll take the train to nowhere and end up in the middle of what some would call a Filipino ghetto. And then I don't know how I get to where I'm going. They originally weren't going to run it to the airport. I'm not sure if they're going to run it to the airport now, because the government decided you can't have people carrying suitcases on the train because of the terrorist threat. Well, who the hell goes to the airport without a suitcase? A terrorist with a one-way ticket paid for in cash. But that's not the way government looks at it.
Well, the major north-south interstate in and out of Houston, which is the fourth largest city in the country, is Interstate 45. And I'm trying to think of I think it's called TxDOT, but I may be wrong.
You've only got 4 more minutes to think.
Oh, for God's sakes.
Yep.
Anyways, they proposed and initially were given funding to widen I-45. I mean, we need to widen it just because we have a lot of New Yorkers and Californians escaping their screwed up states and coming here to Texas. And the Biden administration stopped that whole process dead in its tracks because they said widening an interstate is racist, particularly if you widen it in a downtown area, and I-45 goes through the downtown of Houston. So it stopped cold. Well, just as one example of how stupid that is that's the key artery for an escape route during hurricane season. And you can't get on I-10 because I-10 going east and west, you might still get nailed by a hurricane. I mean, right down to the wire, hurricane shift. So the only way to possibly escape it, if it's going to be a direct hit on Houston, is to evacuate on I-45. And the population here is growing by leaps and bounds, and fueled by people escaping blue state idiocy. And we're coming into hurricane season, and that's where it's at. That's how Biden handles things. And now we're going to give that guy the keys to a huge infrastructure plan.
Well, you triggered something I normally don't want to talk about, but racism. And I think you sent me something on terms that are now considered racist, like council member and whatever.
Even the word picnic.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. This was Brandeis, I mispronounced it, Brandeis. Am I saying it correctly? University?
Brandeis University, yes.
Brandeis. I don't know why I can't get that right. I mean, I'm sure familiar with Brandeis. They're a private elite school, right? They've published a list of no-nos that faculty members and students cannot use certain words and phrases. And if I don't have it in front of me, but if I was to read that list, I've got to believe people would be dumbfounded. But this is mind control. That's what this cancel culture is all about. It's about mind control and big government flanked by big tech and the radical liberals is all about in assuring that there's no more individualism. No more critical thought, as you talked about earlier in this podcast. They just want robotic replies, even all the goofiness of changing pronouns, because now there's 452 genders. I mean, I sure don't remember that as a youngster. Do you?
Nope. And I think next week, whatever, we ought to delve into this a little bit more, because you touched on something that really hit a chord with me, and that's the statues for Floyd. And, I mean, the whole thing, the guy, from what I've seen, was not an upstanding citizen.
Not at all. And by the way, he was from the Houston area. That's not where, he met his demise. But nonetheless, they brought him back to Houston, and the Democratic mayor, and this was at the height of the pandemic, and, the requirement to stay indoors and to wear masks, and social distancing, and closure of bars, restaurants, a third of the economy. And the mayor put on a shindig, had civil rights activists from all over the country. And I mean, none of that was required of American citizens happened at that guy's funeral. So it's just utter hypocrisy, the stuff that goes on.
Well, a closing thought. If you get a chance, Google KHNL TV, especially on HPD, Hawaiian Police Department. They, because they're bringing a bunch of officers to trial for murder. Not a bunch, but it had to do with 2 cases. And the TV station did an interesting interview thing on the police, the racial mix in Hawaii, and all the rest of the stuff. It's really a good starting point to kind of look at things. And
Can I build on that as
on their website?
Can I build on that quickly?
Yes, but you're already over by 2 minutes.
Portland, Oregon, that's been under siege by BLM and Antifa in the downtown on no man's land for over a year now, where they throw Molotov cocktails into police headquarters and into federal buildings. I mean, it may be the worst city for rioting in the country. The trained riot squad en masse has just resigned from the Portland PD. Meanwhile, you know what the city's response is to that?
No.
They've started a multi-million-dollar tourist campaign to get tourists to come back to Portland.
Well, I also saw something, and I think it was last night, is Portland is now surpassing Chicago for murders.
Well, and you know who's surpassing Portland and Chicago? Houston. City council's all Democrat, the mayor's Democrat, and right now we're on track to exceed 500 homicides this year. I mean, I pick on Chicago, and justifiably so, but just down, I don't live in Houston, I'm north of Houston, but in a manner of speaking, just down the road, it's a no man's land as well.
Okay.
And this administration,
And with that, we got to shut it off, for Facebook to say it's too long.
Good talking to you.
Talk to you next week.
Okay.